I didn't think I was going to review this film. And even running this now, I'm still conflicted on whether or not I should. You see, I've been exceptionally lucky. Lucky enough to build a career sharing my love and passions for the stories that have given me and so many others across the globe so much joy. And I'm happy to say that 7 years into the gig, I'm still very happy. Happy to have built something I'm proud of, something I can work on with my friends, and something I can support my now growing family with. However, this time last year, almost exactly 1 year ago to this day in fact, it was almost entirely taken away.
Resident easily the most requested story from the past 24 hours.
150 videos in a single day.
Splurge of copyright issue.
Copyright related copyright system.
Overnight, my entire professional path had been stripped from me and I didn't know what to do, but thanks to all of you and a select few working at YouTube, I got to keep making videos. Like I said, I'm very lucky, but why bring this up at all? Well, last year I said I would boycott this film and encouraged others who felt similarly to do the same. And despite the wrongs having been righted and all my videos having been returned, it still feels weird to talk about this film. I really don't like talking about what happened to me last year. I'm sincerely not someone that succumbs to anxiety really ever, but this was a different story. There's a reason I haven't mentioned it in almost a year, but I also don't like the idea of something like this hanging over my head, ruling my life for me. I want to be able to enjoy Dragon Ball's films and TV shows again. And so, because I feel like I should, and a lot of people want me to, I'm going to review this film. However, because of what happened, I don't personally feel comfortable monetizing this video. And so, due to that, 100% of the proceeds this video generates will be donated to the Red Cross this Christmas. With that said, I do have a lot to say about this film, and I have intentionally withheld all of my thoughts concerning it so as not to impact, for better or worse, the expectations of others online. So, after all that preamble, I'm Toy Nut Mark, and here's my review for the visually impressive, narratively interesting Dragon Ball Super Superhero. 2022's Dragon Ball Super Superhero is almost the perfect Dragon Ball film, and I don't throw around those words all too lightly. Having enjoyed probably about 85% of the film without complaint mostly, I can confidently say from the outset that if you have yet to see this film or are on the fence, you can call this my go ahead and watch the film, it's worth it signal, because I think it's really solid and has just been released on Blu-ray for Christmas if you're so inclined. With that out of the way, the film in question takes a frankly refreshing and wonderful new direction unlike anything we've yet seen from Dragon Ball's story, even when counting the greater series itself, because Dragon Ball Super Superhero is first and foremost a story about Piccolo and Pan, two characters that have either never been given a fair chance to lead their own story or have been given a chance with horrendous characterization. I stand by everything I said about Pan in my Dragon Ball GT review, by the way. The point is, going into this film having really no expectations, a keen enthusiasm for Piccolo and indeed Pan herself, and the knowledge that Piccolo is still Akira Toriyama's favorite character from the series only further stoked the embers of my excitement as a movie goer. But did it live up to these expectations? The beginnings to this film, similarly to how Broly opened, deals with establishing the context and backdrop for this film's action and dramatics, but in totally different ways. In fact, each film takes the opposite approach to the other in philosophy of communicating the necessary exposition. And in the same way Broly wouldn't have made sense without the backstory for the Saiyans, this movie too wouldn't have made sense without this introduction, or should I say reintroduction, to the story's main antagonistic force, the Red Ribbon Army. Dragon Ball Super Broly isn't a perfect film by any means. I say as much in the review I wrote for it. However, when the introduction to that story came with all of its history and preamble, it felt enriching because we got to experience the emotions and set pieces which set the stage and reinforced the motivations for the generational conflicts that took place later on in the film. In a similar fashion, this movie deals with revenge or retribution to a certain extent, albeit through a very different lens, with Magenta looking to reignite the strength of the one-time powerful Red Ribbon Army his father created. However, this film seems to be in a much more complicated circumstance than that which the Broly film enjoyed. Where that movie showed us all the setup and history, this one decided to err on the side of show less, tell more, and get through this part as fast as humanly possible, and you know what? I can kinda see why. On its face, it's easy to say that Show Don't Tell is a rock-solid rubric to follow in earnest, but given that I think hardcore fans know this story like the back of their hand already, and most importantly, casual fans largely don't care about older classic Dragon Ball, they may have made the right call with this one, in skipping over this material. However, for me, I personally would have much preferred to see Magenta witness these monumental moments, rebuild and set these goals for himself, rather than being told about it, because I think that's where the magic lies. However, I will also concede that it depends on the situation, and seeing the destruction of the Saiyans' homeworld on Broly would probably be more interesting than seeing an orphan kid keep tabs on the likes of Goku, Piccolo, and Gohan over the years. With that said, when we do eventually get our first proper scene, I immediately fell in love with the direction of this film. Prior to release, CGI was the massive, awkward-looking elephant in the room, and I, like many others, feared what this movie might have looked like. I've been very critical in the past concerning live-action or CGI remakes of classic 2D films, and having grown up with traditionally hand-drawn Dragon Ball, that was where my preferences resided, and largely to this day still do. However, having seen Dragon Ball clumsily handled in the 3D medium more times than I could have counted, when I saw that our first view of the film in 3D was through the perspective of one of the Red Ribbon Army's bugs, you know, those android bug things that keep tabs for the likes of Cell's development, well, I thought it was not only narratively cute, but visually reassuring. Swooping camera angles, dynamic shots, all providing visuals that were not only beautiful, but ones that would have been exceptionally difficult to pull off in a 2D environment convincingly. Meaning, to me at least, that this film wasn't in 3D for the sake of it, the medium wasn't being used as a crutch, but instead a launching pad. With Carmine, his assistant, demonstrating his quirky predilection for PowerPoint presentations, Magenta sharing in his father's humorously depicted lack of height and a misfortune with tea, and finally Dr. Hedo, an eccentric, offbeat, but importantly different person to his grandfather, that he, Magenta, wants to co-opt into his organization. And as a quick aside, I particularly like this part of the conversation where Magenta is presenting Hedo with visuals from his phone, and in one of the shots you can clearly see that this is a freeze frame from the game Dragon Ball Z Kakarot. Nice one, Toei. Which brings us 13 minutes into the film itself, and truthfully, if you were expecting the same emotional, history and character-rich opening as Broly, at this point you might have realized that this film is a much slower, lower stakes, and more slice-of-life styled affair. And that might not be everyone's idea of a good Dragon Ball film, and truthfully, going into the movie, I wasn't entirely convinced either. I was worried that it might feel like something closer to that of a TV special, and while in some ways it does feel like that from time to time, I think for those that prefer this lighter atmosphere, it's one of the movie's biggest drawing factors, particularly once we get our first scenes with Piccolo and Pan.
Okay, so I get sponsorship stuff in post all the time, but this is actually sick, okay? So just come over here. I got a load of display stuff.
So these are something called displays. Now, displays are super high quality metal posters you can put on your wall. Putting on your wall in a way that I've recently never seen being done before. It's actually really cool and convenient too. There are tons of designs available, but yeah, I got a bunch of superhero stuff because I'm like a giant nerd that way. So I got a Doctor Strange. I got a Spider-Man, and I got a Spider-Man again. What am I doing? To apply it to your wall, all you've got to do is use the cleaners they provide to make sure the surface is smooth and free of any grit or grime. Wait 10 minutes, place your protective leaf on the wall you just cleaned, and then put the magnet on, and it's done. It's honestly as simple as that. If you would want some displays for yourself, then click the link down below in the description. It comes with a lovely little discount. In fact, there's a few levels to these discounts too, I believe. Also, if you buy a display, then some of the money goes towards planting trees in Africa. So if that's something you'd like to contribute to and get some sick metal artwork, click the link down below. It really helps the channel. This pairing here, I was honestly a little unsure of during Super, as we never really got to see much from them. But this dynamic on display between these two bubbled up nostalgia from the back of my mind that I wasn't prepared for. We've seen how Piccolo doted over Pan when she was a young baby, however, this is different. Now she's roughly the same age or size at least as Gohan was when they first met, meaning now we get to see that resemblance plain as day through Pan. Pan has her mother's tenacity when it comes to wanting to engage in conflict and fighting, and her father Gohan's kindness when it comes to engaging with Piccolo. Seeing how she offers him water, thinks of him and his feelings, and how they both make each other feel something more than they otherwise would alone is a beautiful thing to see unfold, and only something a story as long and winding as Dragon Ball can enjoy enjoyed to this extent. There's plenty of wonderfully endearing character acting communicated visually through the CGI animation, whether it be Pan's always trying to do right by Piccolo, her losing her footing, the way Piccolo holds his phone, or even the way he scrapes Gohan's window to get his attention. These are all wonderfully character-rich and quirky traits which this film is filled with. However, once the curtain closes on Piccolo's conversation with Gohan and his smashing new haircut, the film has effectively set up two stories it ultimately wants to tell. We have the villains in the Red Ribbon Army manipulating Dr. Hedo and the Gammas for the worse, and Piccolo trying to convince Gohan to take his training seriously for the better, something he ultimately ends up manipulating him to do. It's a wonderful set of contrasting circumstances with plenty of history and potential specific to both Gohan, Piccolo, and indeed the Red Ribbon Army itself. At this point, I was thrilled to see where this story would go. Ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce you to possibly my new favorite character in modern Dragon Ball, or at least one of them. One of the two superhero-themed androids created by Dr. Hedo, Gamma 2 is easily the most boisterous of the two with a strong presence and flashy skill set. In a refreshing way, mind you. Poses, giant text appearing as if it were a comic strip. If it wasn't for the terrific action accompanying this, you'd forget this wasn't straight from the pages of a manga. And I will absolutely take this as my first of many opportunities to analyze the music of this film because I loved it. Despite the sudden shift away from what we were familiar with during Dragon Ball Super's anime and the Broly film respectively, newcomer composer Naoki Sato brings something entirely more restrained to the table of Dragon Ball Superhero that Sumitomo didn't with his masterclass on Broly. And in being the temporary successor to modern Dragon Ball's mainstay composer Mr. Norihito Sumitomo, it's only natural to notice the differences in their approaches of these two films. While Sumitomo was known for boisterous fight tracks, a wide variety of motifs, and a varied range of instrumentation, Sato very clearly chooses the more measured route for this film. The number of distinct motifs is small, the range of instrumentation is narrow, and track count is light, 23 to Superhero compared to Broly's 33. But this is not necessarily a bad thing at all. What this approach does allow Sato to do is very precisely solidify character themes, associations, and an overall distinct soundscape for the movie. Piccolo's fight with Gamma 2 is a very powerful example of all of these elements. The main theme during the fight, entitled The Gamma Androids, is actually an extrapolation of the opening sequence theme introduced in the title track Avant Title, with that same arpeggiating motif appearing in other Red Ribbon Army related tracks throughout the film. So already at the beginning of this fight, we were able to subconsciously put together that very association with the army using that very relation. However, this isn't to say that Gamma 2 doesn't shine through musically in this track though. His personality is far too loud for it not to, with that incredibly high-spirited, dare I say heroic and uplifting melody playing over the fight, signaling not only the fun of the scene, but also hinting to the more genuinely heroic nature of the Gammas themselves. All of this is wonderfully orchestrated with Sato's Raimi Spider-Man-esque sets of woodwinds, horns, and strings. It's infectious and I utterly loved it. However, while I do love this first interaction between Gamma 2 and Piccolo both musically and visually, I do find the series of events that unfold following this encounter to be almost too coincidental and remarkable to be believable. Almost. If it was simply just the case of Gamma 2 being negligent and Piccolo just so happening to be able to break into the main office without issue, then I'd still be able to, suspend my disbelief. I'd have no issue, but the fact that this all happens and Piccolo just so happens to arrive in time for the bad guys to basically give a rundown of their whole evil plan right in front of him felt so on the nose and convenient I just had to point it out. I still like a lot of the stuff that happens following this, but couple this with a very fast-forwarded introduction, it's just another example of somewhat contrived storytelling for the sake of story progression. Which can be fine, but it needs to be worth it, so is it? Well, we get the Chekhov's gun known as Cell Max introduced in this film, and to tell you the truth, when I heard about this impending character, I started to fear for how this film might shape up if they were to rely on yet another returning villain from the past. Lord knows I didn't love Resurrection F, I want something new from these films. Were they going to go the direction of Resurrection F where they just bring back old characters, or were they going to go the way of Broly and reinvent the past? Well, curiously, the answer was neither, but I'll leave that for a later section. This is perhaps the most mixed I feel concerning this film, with perhaps the exception of one later scene. On a visual front, the models for these characters feel a lot more scuffed than any other used in this film, all the while adhering to the same breakneck and fantastically impressive storyboard with these adrenaline-filled action sequences. However, at the same time as this, you have questionable dialogue exchanges where Goku claims to be taken aback by Vegeta's sudden use of image training or meditation, something he should be intimately familiar with. However, with all of that aside, the broader purpose, ironically enough, of this scene is to excuse all of these characters on Beerus's world away from the action that takes place on Earth. And ultimately, the scene itself results in Piccolo being unable to gather the Earth's greatest fighters to combat this new significant threat made visible through the likes of Cell Max. This isn't, of course, to say that this scene doesn't offer something substantial either. Something this scene, and indeed this film, does exceptionally well, as I've mentioned, is character acting. Remember when I said that Goku not knowing how to image train was strange? Well, at least they made it a plot point to call back to within this very sequence. Goku's issue is that he's thinking too conventionally, too straightforward. He's all about the action and too eager to get into the next big fight. Far too busy being distracted by that to explore other avenues of progression like Vegeta has done in this film through meditation. Whis even compliments Vegeta for this correct choice he's made, but the visual callback that I love comes in how the film visually communicates this aspect of Goku's character to us. To commence his sparring, Goku is seen standing, almost falling over, and even trips over his own feet as he charges Vegeta, who's standing in a more advantageous position, feet planted, arms folded, waiting for the counterattack. It's a subtle piece of characterization, but it's wonderful to see it employed so effectively in the scene, despite the strange dialogue exchange it stemmed from. However, as they spar, Beerus flirts with Chilai and Broly watches on. The communicator rings off the hook. So, now struggling to get in touch with the most reliable fighters of this era, realizing that he does not match up to the Gammas physically, Piccolo has a terrific idea to boost his own chances. This is what is so unbelievably refreshing about this film. I love Goku and Vegeta as much as the next guy, but watching as Piccolo is forced to use his mind to overcome the challenges at hand is wonderful, to say the least. With the pressing circumstances forcing him to examine what's at his disposal, concluding the same power-up Krillin and Gohan received on Namek would serve his cause exceptionally well. I've seen some folks online complain about this sudden power-up through a wish from the dragon, but to me it's about the same as the power-up the other two received on Namek. And if those are fine for us to get past, so should this. Plus, given that Piccolo is a special Namekian, they were his Dragon Balls to begin with, and he's a defender of the Earth, it's a power-up that's his by right more so than the likes of Gohan and Krillin on Namek, I thought. And as Piccolo is reinvigorated with this new goal of wishing on the Dragon Balls for this power, the team behind this film reminds me yet again of their amazing musical work as Piccolo leaps from the lookout with the clouds swirling, Karl and Yajirobe hawking him his helmet. There's a gorgeous cocktail of visual and musical components that complement and elevate this occasion far higher than it ever would alone. This track that plays as Piccolo descends from the heavens entitled Shenron once again makes great use of the very superhero music trademark sounding instrumentation and approach. Ever since the first Superman theme penned by the illustrious John Williams, superhero films have echoed those signature horns across their soundtracks, and this film is no different. Leading in with descending strings, it explodes into this wonderfully triumphant swirling cacophony of horns and brass instrumentation, and once again does fantastic work at getting across to the audience the exact type of film we are witnessing here. This is an heroic tale in which even someone as often neglected as Piccolo will meet challenges and be forced to find a way to persevere and overcome them. Furthermore, you can feel Toriyama's influence oozing out of scripts during scenes like The Wish with Shenron and Bulma. Every exchange has some sort of gag attached to complement the dialogue or undercut the seriousness of the occasion in a tasteful way. It's a harmless addition, but the notion that Bulma makes such frivolous wishes every year through the Dragon Balls is hilarious. This could come as a surprise to some of you, but this scene might actually be one of my favorites in the film. The sequence and idea behind taking Pan back to the hideout with the added dramatic irony of us knowing much more than the bad guys in this instance is very fun, but there's a lot more to this scene than might meet the eye on first viewing. On the surface, the purpose of this scene is for Piccolo to co-opt Pan into this scheme to coax her dad Gohan out of being a bookworm long enough to instill within him once again that training is important. However, there are some really nice subtle touches this film adds to emphasize this aspect. Firstly, upon beating up this bad guy, Pan immediately identifies Piccolo despite the disguise he has on due to her sensing his ki. It's a nice callback to the first scene they share in this film and further bonds Piccolo and Pan together in a natural way. At the same time, once Piccolo goes, again in disguise, to reveal that Pan has been kidnapped to Gohan, he doesn't notice Piccolo's ki and perhaps most importantly, doesn't even recognize the unique and obvious way Piccolo scrapes the window to get his attention. He's living in his own world, totally oblivious, and by that same token, in the same way this scene serves to further bond Piccolo to Pan, Gohan not recognizing this to be Piccolo for me further emphasizes the distance that's forming between them. Oh, also, this might not have anything to do with the plot, but it's a really cute Easter egg I found after watching this film for like the third time. As you know, Piccolo has made it something of his mission in this film to infiltrate the base of the Red Ribbon Army time and time again. And if you notice on the uniform he's using as a disguise, and now wears for the majority of the film, it has the number 94 emblazoned across the chest. And if you go to chapter 94 of Dragon Ball, you'll find that it's the very first chapter Goku infiltrates the Red Ribbon Army's base and causes all sorts of damage. It's a cute Easter egg that captures the very first 2D animated scene of this film perfectly. This is also where we get our second main musical motif of the film, entitled Awakening, when Gohan ascends into his Super Saiyan form, as well as when Gohan assumes his ultimate form. Once again boasting arpeggiating strings and a powerful brass melody, this theme is not only fantastically heroic sounding, but it also mirrors the Gamma's theme in every conceivable way. This narrow range of approach for the two main themes not only solidifies the sonic signature of the film itself, but also does some light storytelling of its own, signifying to the viewers and listeners that the Gammas and our heroes are not so different after all. It's around this point also in the film that the action really starts to ramp up more consistently, and we enter effectively the final scene of the film, long as it is. One thing perhaps worth noting on is that Broly, despite being criticized for having too much fighting, doesn't actually have much more fighting than this film does, with the important difference being that this movie paces the action, in my opinion, far more effectively. Where Broly's movie had uninterrupted action for almost 40 minutes, interspliced in this film are plenty of character-rich exchanges and plot progression moments to help the action we do ultimately get feel less one-note as a result. That said, I'm sure Broly's style of approach has plenty of fans too. It's all down to how you prefer things personally. Continuing on through the film, however, within these prelude fights to the climax, both Gohan and Piccolo get to stretch their respective legs against both of the Gammas. And during these fights, I love how they communicate how different these two androids are. Honestly, we haven't gotten to see much from number 1 in this film outside of scolding number 2 for being, I don't know, too lax, but the style with which he fights tells us a lot about him. His movements feel more deliberate, robotic even, as if they're being delivered with a clinical precision the likes of which Gamma 2 never administered. And honestly, it fits his much more stoic and straightforward demeanor. And in truth, these scenes, despite them showcasing the Gammas as something of unwitting antagonists, it makes me love them all the more. They're easily my favorite new addition to the series. Orange Piccolo. This might actually be a hot take, I'm not entirely sure, and I know that this character and this design gets ragged on a lot, but I think I actually love Piccolo's new form aesthetically. I'm so tired of these traditionally handsome transformations, for lack of a better term, and I like that this one took a very different direction to that of a Super Saiyan variety transformation. There's this somewhat predominant drive, not just in Dragon Ball largely, but in broader anime and manga in general, to have the latter forms or transformations act sort of like the swanning or butterfly moment of the character. And in many ways, I can understand why that fits metaphorically speaking, with that form being the full realization of the character in question. However, in a story like Dragon Ball, which has become, whether you like to admit it or not, inundated with transformations of various kinds, you have to consider that if everyone is made to look special and the same, then nothing is special. Ken Sugimori, the artist behind some of your favorite Pokemon, has come out and saying that a big part of his success in design isn't so much trying to create cool looking Pokemon all the time, it's drawing a character that has unsightly or somewhat dorky features that can be mixed in with traditionally cool features to amplify them. I think Orange Piccolo does just that. There's something unconventional and awkward about the design. He's a giant Oompa Loompa. But damn it if I don't think that this also looks kind of awesome too. Like, That dorky aspect of his design almost highlights the badass elements, and this is all coupled with the booming and almost sinister soundtrack that accompanies his appearance and initial attack on Gamma 2. Something I found interesting as well is that there are slight differences between Toriyama's initial design of this character and the illustration Kubota drew for the purposes of this film. At first glance, it looks like they're the same image, almost traced with a palette swap on the clothes, but if you look closely, the shapes in Toriyama's are much softer and, well, I would argue nicer compared to the boxier and perhaps stiffer Kubota. However, the anatomy on the arm of Kubota's makes a lot more sense with his illustration, allowing Piccolo to actually sort of look like he's taking steps forward. Alright, that does it. I gotta draw this guy sometime. I love him that much. Like, holy hell. If you're an artist, you'll know that this is the highest compliment of which we are capable. Personally, I don't think I have an issue with Cell Max as a concept or as a character, really. He is so demonstrably different to Perfect Cell,
Mr. Perfect Cell,
even semi-perfect Cell of which he's based, that I can't even be upset. I wouldn't even consider him a character of any description necessarily. He has a character design, I guess, but his operation in the plot feels more like a doomsday weapon than an actual character with needs and wants. I sort of think of him almost like a kaiju monster, and I think that offers Cell Max something Perfect Cell didn't have. He becomes something that amplifies the utility and personalities of characters that interact with him specifically. Where Perfect Cell was a character into and of himself that could carry a given scene, Cell Max requires others to interact with him to demonstrate how great they are. For instance, when he first shows up, immediately he elevates the Gammas. Unlike Gohan, Piccolo, and all the others that suddenly arrive in Bulma's stead, both Gamma 1 and Gamma 2 immediately dive into action to save their creator. I love these characters, and through this act of altruism, we learn that Cell Max has a weak point programmed into him. In other words, doing the right thing in this instance effectively made victory possible. And I don't think there's anything more superhero than that. This was, for me, one of the best moments in this film. What a powerful sacrifice, and so incredibly depicted. Missing its mark slightly, leaving Piccolo to block the final crushing attack on the now lifeless, colorless husk of Gamma 2. And speaking of color, it's around this point that all the special effects animation comes into play, so what better time to talk about the production of this film? The notion of transitioning Dragon Ball from 2D into 3D is a truly scary prospect, given Toriyama's style is one that actively ignores 3D space in the name of looking cool. Now, what does that mean, looking cool? Well, Goku's hair flips around like Mickey Mouse's ears, the mouths on these characters slide off at 3/4 angles along with the far eye compressing. And furthermore, for years, video games across the board have failed to really capture Dragon Ball 100% accurately. Something always kind of felt off, or in some cases, diarrhea. It wasn't until, however, Fighters came along that we started to really see what was possible to achieve in the 3D medium. By dynamically breaking the models and moving things around depending on the angle, Dragon Ball finally looked correct in 3D. The wait for this movie, however, was scary. The majority of the trailers focused really hard on the Goku and Vegeta section of the movie, which is a really short segment and inexplicably ugly for some reason. But the day eventually came, and finally, as I mentioned, I got the chance to sit down and watch this film, and the relief. Let me tell you, dear God, the relief. While the sections on Beerus's planet aren't great, the rest of the movie is a real visual spectacle and fully takes advantage of the approach seen in Fighters. Switching things up from Naohiro Shintani, who worked on the Broly movie, we get in this film the character designs and animation supervision of none other than Chikashi Kubota, someone many of you will probably know as the character designer for the One Punch Man anime. But as it happens, he's also a huge Dragon Ball nerd, having released his own art book for the series and animated a big part of the climax in the recent Broly movie. His super rigid and detailed approach here, however, while probably not best suited for 2D given its complexity, works incredibly well in 3D and brings us right back to the classic late Z era style, much to the delight of many once that 2D opening was released, I'm sure. Now, that's not to say our beloved Shintani, who brought us into a new era of Dragon Ball with the recent movie, was ousted. He's still very much present here in a big way, doing some character designs himself, and also one huge aspect I'll touch on later thanks to the awesome production pipeline created for the purposes of this film specifically. perfectly. In many ways, this is a legitimate collaboration between 2D animators and the CG teams, and this is where it gets a little nerdy, but I promise it's interesting. Like 2D productions, 3D production begins with a discussion on how to visualize the scenes described on the script, which then becomes something known as a storyboard. These roughs encompass the entire film and serve really as the blueprint. After that, the scenes are then delegated to 3D animators who will animate a rudimentary layout based on these storyboards. Admittedly, they look incredibly potato at this point, since there's no lighting and they're using only placeholder assets, but it's important because this is the foundation of the movement used in the film, and it has to be approved by the 3D supervisors before going forward. The next stage is where things really start to come together more. The basic 2D anime effect is added, there's additional rigging done, now Gohan actually has a facial expression. It's starting to get there, but now the 2D staff come into play. In this case, Kubota takes these 3D scenes and draws 2D corrections over the top of them. It's basically the same way that supervisors would correct work on a 2D production, except instead of a 2D animator tracing the corrections onto their work, the CG team uses them as a reference to alter the model to match these corrections. And that's the important difference here. Once complete, the scene is now ready to have its final lighting applied, along with any last-minute details, and it really helps to bring the production to life. Here you can see Gohan's hair has appropriate shading to it, and the background elements finally get a real texture applied. Following this, 2D animators finally get to jump back in and draw corrections directly onto the work. Correcting needless muscle detail on Gohan's arms, for example, drawing the crotch folds properly and whatnot. In the action scenes, however, this step also involves drawing 2D effects like impact frames, beams, and smoke, and other special effects. Interestingly, the fanbase's beloved Yuya Takahashi, famous for producing some of the fantastic scenes from Super on screen right now, was one of the animators who contributed a bunch of the effects, in fact. Long story short, the production for this film was a truly intensive process, with the collaboration between the two teams resulting in a final product that feels not only polished, but importantly, super authentic. It doesn't just end here though. One of the coolest aspects of the film itself is that a great deal of the 3D movement is based on 2D animation that was produced as a reference. For example, Naohiro Shintani drew a layout for the Cell vs Piccolo fight at the end that was apparently so detailed, his fellow staff said it could have straight up been used as a 2D production. It moved that well and was that complete. This is something that is insanely common in Disney's CG productions. You can find a bunch of pencil tests for their work, so it's cool to hear that Toei took a similar approach in this area. On the back of all of this, I wish I could highlight the 3D animators directly on this film, as they obviously deserve a huge amount of credit here. The character animation in particular is so full of life, and the little nuances that take full advantage of 3D are great to see. For instance, I love the extra mile this film went to in order to create visual interest in the absence of narrative intrigue. Whether it be how expressive certain characters are in dialogue-heavy exchanges, or how simple visual stories are added to these scenes to give the audience something to focus on and laugh at during sometimes more mundane occurrences. Unfortunately, the nature of 3D also means that individual traits don't exist like they do in 2D, so unlike the 2D productions where I might recognize how one artist might draw an ear or a nose, I can't point to a specific trait for a 3D production as an animator's calling card. But I did want to just take a moment to really highlight how impressive their work is here. Translating Dragon Ball into 3D isn't easy, but they really nailed it. This could have been a visual disaster, but the collaborative efforts of everyone involved resulted in something that genuinely impressed me. We'll maybe just ignore those janky Beerus planet scenes though. I think it's time for me to finally talk about what everyone seems to either be praising or complaining about in this film. And that is Beast Gohan.
Estos Elfin Cel Rojo.
I don't think this scene can justifiably be entirely disliked or liked by myself realistically, as it has, in my view, both positive and negative attributes narratively. With that said, Beast Gohan is by a wide margin the single most controversial attribute introduced in this film. So let's talk about what I thought. I've seen a lot of people talk and complain about this feeling like a tired way of introducing a new form for the character. When you look at the circumstances being Gohan fighting Cell, drawing on anger only to assume a brand new power, it's easy to see the repetition of this plain as day. However, repetition on its own simply cannot be the issue here. Goku has trained and progressed largely the same way over the years. Why do I not take issues with his transformations and progression the same way I seem to be doing with Gohan? Well, firstly, you're not going to find an admirer of forms like Super Saiyan Blue here. Though there are meaningful differences between the likes of Super Saiyan, the God forms, and Ultra Instinct that allow them to feel distinct from one another. However, that's also not to say that what Gohan experiences doesn't also feel different with Beast Gohan. However, concerning Goku's progression, all of these resulting transformations come about as the result of who Goku is and are emblematic of the journey he was on during the times of their acquisition. In other words, when it comes to Goku, all of his progress comes about naturally through the forward progression of the story and through the desirable traits of his character. Traits like an eagerness to fight and improve. And while Gohan has improved through various means in the past, it feels like it always for Gohan boils down to this awakening aspect of his character and its relationship with transformations or progression in the story. And on one hand, it's easy to see why this is the case. Gohan's anger was incredibly cathartic for audiences and an impressively effective means of breakthrough the first time narratively. I don't need to tell anyone how amazing the first Super Saiyan 2 transformation was against Perfect Cell, but I think it worked because it happened just once. Now, you might be saying, didn't Gohan rage over and over and over again in the series prior to that one moment at the end of the Cell Saga? And the answer is yes. And even when talking about Beast Gohan prior to the film, Akira Toriyama had this to say. Gohan's had quite a few transformations in the past, but this time he needed to awaken to a new one. Gohan has achieved his own unique evolution based off of the sort of awakenings he's had as a boy. I've even named this transformation Son Gohan Beast, in the sense that the wild beast within him has awoken. I don't know how to feel about this personally, but once you let the genie out of the bottle, so to speak, you can't really awaken him again and again and again without it feeling cheaper each and every time. Diminishing returns is a very real thing. You can only be so awake, or are we meant to understand that he goes back to sleep following these moments again? In which case, this is neither progress nor regression, just something that happens. But many might be asking, is there merit to this new form? Is it as bad as other people seem to be claiming? Is there something significant narratively being built upon here? Well, yes and no. It depends on how you look at it, really. The quality of, quote, Gohan's anger in Dragon Ball Z was an attribute that, yes, defined his character, but was also something his character struggled with and built up to. A dilemma he contended with until finally that moment came during his outing against Cell, during which he snapped. Not just out of anger, like he had done dozens and dozens of times prior, but along with that came a newly found resolve and conviction. That was what made that moment significant for millions. Not because of his anger alone, because he got angry and decided to go all out afterwards. The success of that moment, and indeed the story the character of Gohan went on to have in Z, is part of the reason he struggles in some instances to resonate on a comparatively intense level with a wider audience now. I don't think that it's a coincidence the character has had more detractors for his post-Cell material than he enjoyed prior. However, regardless of how one might feel about it, the character had grown past that moment, and in some cases brilliantly so, with the story of the Buu saga reflecting that and the story he enjoyed in Super building off of that idea. To progress and to grow as someone that was no longer a boy, but a man and now a father. To find a path forward that allows him to be who he is, and one that also forces him to address his imminent responsibilities as one of the Earth's most powerful defenders. And personally, the highlight for his character for me comes in how we've seen him grow not only in Super, but also this very film. The use of the Makanko Sapo here speaks to that growth and is 100% narratively and emotionally fulfilling to see as he puts down Cell Max using it. It highlights the growth Gohan has made since Cell, all the while undercutting the suspected distance forming between Piccolo and Gohan established earlier on as nothing more than Gohan having learned his lesson, now training alone off-screen without the need for Piccolo to constantly remind him. Furthermore, musically, the moment is stunning. As Gohan is achieving this ultimate beastly form, and the action has built up to an incredible peak, you would expect some high-energy battle theme to be playing for the transformation and final blow, but Sato rather chooses to completely subvert that expectation and play to the quiet rage of the form. The entire climactic sequence, bathed in rays of purple and greens from the fighters, is accompanied with an immaculately understated atmospheric piece of music. No huge horn sections blasting away as a ki blast is charged, just soft strings and synth holding on a single note, as a quiet guitar gently whispers in and out of existence once in a while. Of course, there would be nothing wrong with a more traditionally climactic track for this moment, but I think we can all agree that this more subversive approach helps cement this moment in the minds of every single viewer as something truly special. Furthermore, actively achieving what I saw this film setting up. Magenta manipulates Dr. Hedo into being another brilliant scientist like Jiro for him to utilize, and Piccolo attempts to manipulate Gohan into being who he wants him to be. However, both soon realize how wrong their initial impressions of these two were later in the film, with Hedo being far more virtuous than his late grandfather, and Gohan having indeed continued to grow and train without the spotlight and watchful eye of his one-time mentor and master. That's a great structure with appropriately contrasting forces of good and evil in the mix, only the film doesn't really let that be the case, at least not entirely. Instead of becoming the sort of person he needed to be during the Cell games, we're reminded that Gohan, frustratingly, is still very much that individual who can seem to be of meaningful value to the team, that can't be the game changer he could be without first emotionally breaking to remind him of what he's truly fighting for. Yet another good android bites the dust, Piccolo on the edge of death. And perhaps in that same vein, following this negative thread, perhaps I'm being too charitable in categorizing Gohan as someone mindful of what might await in the future. He mentions later in the film that he's been keeping up with his training, but I ask, why? Earlier in the film, when Piccolo tells him to keep up his training, Gohan asks why, and wonders if something bad could actually happen to the Earth again. He actually wonders this. This is such an offensively stupid thing for this character to say, I personally think. If there's any character that should know how turbulent the world can be, if there's anyone that should understand how suddenly everything can go to hell, it should be Gohan. It's been his entire life. And so while I can acknowledge what the film is trying to say with Gohan's character, I find myself walking a tightrope where the margin of error is so easily trespassed into. Am I being too harsh or too charitable? If I've made anything clear during this analysis of Gohan's big moment of the film, it's that I feel extremely conflicted. In one breath, relieved and thrilled they seem to be progressing the character, and in another, utterly frustrated and deflated at the thought of this being another moment exactly like what existed before. Awkwardly inserted for the sake of saying, hey, remember that? However, it is important to highlight that during this transformation, Gohan feels distinctly different. With the arrogance he once postured as a child no longer present, however, it does still feel at odds to me. The Beast Gohan character aesthetic and visual harkens back to imagery from his character's greatest moments. Up until now, Gohan's appearance as a child during the Cell games stood in stark contrast with the rest of his character's journey, and visually, that made sense to me. I liked how the Buu saga wanted to give him his own identity, free from the shackles of a Super Saiyan's expectations, a sentiment which was echoed in Super's manga fittingly, and I loved the narrative direction Super's anime took the character, highlighting his arrogance against Cell and Buu specifically, forcing him to become the man he was always meant to be. And while I love the use of the Makanko Sappo by Gohan in this film, with it being easily one of the best single moments his character has contributed to since Cell, the fact that it's framed in this strangely and frankly dated interpretation of the character aesthetically feels at odds with what the moment represents to me personally. The giant spiked hair, so familiar and fitting to the arrogance of a young boy back then, seems to have returned, and perhaps appropriately, the crown now doesn't seem to sit comfortably on the head of this young father anymore, almost like it's forcing an appearance upon this man of which he's personally outgrown. However, alternatively, one could look at this familiar and lofty shape as his reclaiming of who he once was at the height of his character's popularity, while the color shift away from the golden spectacle he boasted during the Cell saga might also indicate this noticeable sense of responsibility he retains while in this form that replaces the arrogance he embodied during his younger years once he did cut loose. Maybe this form is a perfect marriage between the states of being the Gohan character has explored, opening him up to embracing what makes who he is as a character different now. Maybe. Maybe I'm being too cynical. Maybe I'm being too charitable. Or maybe Akira Toriyama just thought it looked cool. Whatever the case, you can decide how you feel for yourselves. In my opinion, the Climax didn't need Gohan to transform the way that he did, because he had already transformed in another, more meaningful way that actually mattered. In the past, transformations in Dragon Ball signified a change in mentality, a growth beyond who they once were, freeing them to explode past their latent potential and do wondrous things as a result in this new form. The new form didn't bring about a new personality, this new outlook brought about that new form. How they looked aesthetically, while important for selling toys and admittedly bonding us to the character, was sort of secondary. with the story itself narratively interweaving the physical changes with the emotional and spiritual change that would occur within the character itself. Unlike these past occurrences, however, despite Dragon Ball Super's superhero brandishing a shiny new transformation for the character that has undergone personal growth, the form and the growth integral for the transformation to work, in my mind, feel entirely disconnected from each other. The reason why Gohan's Super Saiyan 2 transformation worked so powerfully was because it was not just built up to, but represented an instance in time where the character changed both emotionally and physically together. In this film, the emotion and physical changes feel entirely disconnected from one another. A character having achieved a sense of personal growth worthy of praise and celebration off screen, then undercut by a transformation that feels like it's scratching and clawing to recapture what it once was, despite the character now having outgrown it. And I don't think that's fair. Fair for this film, or fair for it to be a person's parting feelings concerning it. There were plenty of criticisms I offered in good faith towards this film, but that isn't to suggest I disliked it at all. Because, as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, this is almost a perfect Dragon Ball film to me. It's filled with so much character, passion, and lore that upon watching it for my second and eventually third times around, I only fell in love with it all the more. This film, I don't think, was ever designed to shake things up or present the Dragon Ball canon with anything monumental. And I think that's okay. Transformations aside, I think this film had a lot of heart, and at the end of the day, a single moment in time that I didn't enjoy isn't enough to bring down a film like this for me. Because, once again, this is a movie about preserving what was through sacrifice, through heroism. Whether it be through Gamma's sacrifice or whether it be through this film's touching ending. Pan eagerly awaiting to demonstrate her newfound ability to soar high into the air. If there's anything I've learned this year, it's that what we have right now can be taken away at any moment. But similarly to this film's final moments, we should always be able to find solace in the fact that no matter how bad things get, time always moves on. The young progress forward, and there will always be something new around the next corner. I hope I've perhaps encouraged some of you out there who might have written off this film entirely to at least give it another shot. It starts slower than I'd like personally, but once it does get going, it's a very fun ride. Hopefully, Dragon Ball can carry this momentum onwards to whatever their next production will be, but until then, I hope you enjoyed this video, and thank you so much for the love and support this year. Happy Christmas, happy holidays, and a very happy New Year to one and all. Oh, also, this film has a post-credits scene, and after all the praise I've given this movie for being faithful to the genre, that might just be the most superhero movie thing this film has done yet.